Welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right into one of the absolute wildest, most fascinating, and honestly deeply misunderstood chapters in American history: Prohibition, the Great American Paradox. We're going to cut straight through all the noise today to show you exactly how an entire nation decided to literally outlaw its favorite beverages and what really went down when the government actually tried to enforce that ban.
Whenever we hear the word prohibition, our minds immediately jump to those classic gangster myths, right? We picture the Tommy guns, the secret speakeasies, the corrupt cops. It's almost universally remembered as just the single biggest policy failure in U.S. history. But actually, was it really as straightforward as we think? Today, we're putting that popular narrative to the test. We'll look at the historical data, dig into the massive unintended consequences, and uncover some really surprising public health metrics that completely scramble the story we thought we knew.
So here is our roadmap for today. We'll kick things off with the push for prohibition, then we'll check out the loopholes in the law, dive into crime, culture, and cocktails, break down the economics of repeal, and finally wrap things up with the prohibition legacy.
All right, let's get into Section 1, the push for prohibition.
Now, this monumental shift wasn't just some sudden overnight ban. Not at all. It was actually the result of a highly organized, century-long political campaign. Way back in the 1820s, the temperance movement started taking root in evangelical Protestantism, basically driven by the belief that alcohol was the absolute root cause of poverty and domestic violence. Then you see the Women's Christian Temperance Union, founded in 1874, followed by the Anti-Saloon League in 1893. These groups were incredible at taking early moral arguments and turning them into hardball politics. The Anti-Saloon League, for instance, became arguably the most effective single-issue political machine in all of American history. They literally did not care about your political party, they only cared if you voted dry. And that immense, relentless pressure is exactly what led to the 18th Amendment passing Congress in 1917, with Prohibition taking full effect in January 1920.
What's absolutely fascinating here is how four completely distinct forces managed to converge at just the perfect time, between 1917 and 1919, to make this politically unstoppable. First, you had all this progressive-era reform energy, which was the exact same impulse driving pure food laws. At the same time, you had rising nativism, which unfairly linked saloons to Irish and German immigrants. Then World War I hits. Anti-German sentiment completely discredits the brewing industry, since, well, a lot of brewers had German names. Plus, grain conservation suddenly gave everyone a very patriotic excuse to stop making alcohol. Finally, women, who were the ones pushing the absolute hardest for temperance, were finally gaining the right to vote. It was just the perfect storm.
Which brings us to Section 2, loopholes in the law.
Okay, so the 18th Amendment made prohibition the law of the land, sure, but it was the Volstead Act of 1919 that actually laid out the enforcement mechanics. And the really crucial point to understand here is that they set an incredibly strict limit. Anything over 0.5% alcohol was banned. That meant beer and wine were gone too. This actually shocked a ton of moderate supporters. A lot of people had assumed they were just getting rid of the hard liquor in the gritty saloons, and that a nice glass of wine with dinner would still be totally legal. Well, the Volstead Act proved them very, very wrong.
But despite how strict that definition looks on paper, the law was actually incredibly leaky in practice. People found so many semi-legal ways to keep drinking. First off, doctors could legally prescribe whiskey for various ailments, which, surprise, surprise, led to an absolutely booming pharmacy business. Then you had these sudden spikes in church and synagogue memberships, which very conveniently coincided with the religious exemptions for sacramental wine. And get this, you were legally allowed to make up to 200 gallons of fruit juice at home every year, which, funny enough, tends to ferment into alcohol if you just happen to leave it alone in your basement. Finally, massive amounts of industrial alcohol were just straight up diverted by bootleggers.
Let's move on to Section 3, crime, culture, and cocktails.
Now, when a vastly underfunded government tries to police millions of thirsty citizens, things can take a genuinely dark turn. Remember that diverted industrial alcohol we just talked about? Well, to try and enforce morality, the government intentionally denatured it. They literally added lethal chemicals to it. The entire idea was just to scare people away from drinking it. But bootleggers would steal it anyway, try to renature it or clean it up, and often do a completely terrible job before turning around and selling it to the public.
Over 10,000. That is the staggering estimated number of people who died because of these deliberately added lethal chemicals. It's an incredibly grim reminder of the extreme, frankly shocking measures the government took during this era to force compliance.
And socially, the law completely backfired. Before 1920, drinking was almost entirely confined to these working-class, heavily male-dominated saloons. But once you drive it underground, drinking shifted to the speakeasies. Instead of stopping the habit, the law accidentally modernized it. Speakeasies were mixed gender. They felt risky. They felt glamorous. This era basically intertwined with the Jazz Age and did a massive amount to normalize women drinking in public. Plus, because that bootleg liquor we just mentioned usually tasted absolutely awful, modern cocktail culture just exploded as a way to mask the bad taste.
Now, let's talk about the financial side of this underworld. $100 million. That figure was the estimated annual value of Al Capone's Chicago empire alone. He controlled the breweries, the speakeasies, the gambling. He built this massive wealth almost effortlessly, all thanks to the enormous enforcement vacuum the government created.
With the Prohibition Bureau severely underfunded, these underpaid agents had absolutely no chance of policing over 18,000 miles of coastline and borders. So, organized crime aggressively stepped right into that void. Capone cemented his total dominance with the brutal St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929. Then you had figures like Lucky Luciano stepping up to build a highly organized business-like national crime syndicate. Smugglers literally set up a floating rum row right off the Atlantic coast. And just to put things in perspective, in New York City alone, estimates suggest there were over 30,000 speakeasies operating. That was actually more drinking establishments than existed in the city before Prohibition even started.
All right, turning to Section 4, the economics of repeal.
By the time we enter the early 1930s, the national conversation shifts drastically away from morality and pivots straight to sheer economic survival. So we really have to ask, what finally broke the immense political power of the Dries? What exactly forces an unprecedented reversal of the U.S. Constitution?
Put simply, the Great Depression was the final nail in the coffin. Before Prohibition, taxes on alcohol were a massive source of federal revenue. With the economy suddenly collapsing, the government desperately needed that tax money back, not to mention the jobs the legal alcohol industry provided. On top of that, all the visible lawlessness and gang violence had completely destroyed the law's legitimacy in the eyes of the public. You also had brilliant organizers like Pauline Sabin stepping up to mobilize respectable women against the ban, which proved once and for all that it wasn't just criminals who wanted to drink. All of this momentum culminated in Franklin D. Roosevelt successfully campaigning on a platform of repeal in 1932.
And finally, we arrive at Section 5, the Prohibition legacy.
In 1933, the 21st Amendment officially passed, completely repealing the 18th. To this day, it remains the only constitutional amendment ever to be outright repealed. But here is the critical part that shapes our world today. It left the regulation of alcohol entirely up to individual states. This specific state-level delegation is the exact reason why, nearly a century later, we still have to navigate this confusing patchwork system of dry counties, weird sale hours, and state-controlled liquor stores.
It's really interesting because popular memory, largely cemented by Hollywood and big documentaries, remembers Prohibition as this complete, unquestionable failure defined entirely by gangsters and corruption. But the actual public health data tells a slightly different story. Economists and historians point out that during Prohibition, deaths from liver diseases like cirrhosis, as well as other alcohol-related illnesses, actually saw a measurable decline. So that whole narrative of a total failure is definitely a bit more complicated when you look at the raw health data.
So I want to leave you with this provocative thought to chew on. Where exactly is the true balance between public health and government overreach? The legacy of Prohibition basically forces us to grapple with the absolute limits of legislating human behavior. Can we ever successfully force morality and health through the Constitution, or do the unintended consequences just always end up outweighing the benefits? Definitely something to think about the next time you're out buying a drink. Thank you so much for learning with me today, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.